Hello, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be looking at this 2019 Sierra with a vent valve solenoid circuit issue. We're going to be doing some electrical testing and trying to figure out what is the issue with that circuit in particular, and we're going to look into that repair. I wanted to create this section to explain a little bit about the vent valve solenoid and the emission system, just so you can follow along in the video. So the evaporative emission system takes care of emissions created by the fuel that is in the tank and wants to prevent those emissions to escape to the atmosphere. So what the system does is trap those emissions, and then after we use the vehicle and the engine is running, it burns those gases so they don't escape to the atmosphere. They are, and the way that consistent most in system works, I'm just gonna give your rough reference. Fuel tank. This is not adaptable to all vehicles. Some have different actuators, different valves, different designs, but for the most part, they are consistent in that they have a fuel tank, and then we also have the engine, and between those two we have a line that connects the fuel tank to the engine. Just right before the engine, we have a small valve called the purge solenoid. And then before the tank, we have the vent solenoid. So what happens is, as those emission gases accumulate in the tank, when the fuel gets evaporated or heated up, they start to accumulate. Once we start driving the vehicle, the purge valve will open and cause those gases to go into the engine where they get burned up. But if the vent is not open, the gases cannot escape. So the way they do that is open the vent and then open the purge, and those gases will get sucked in to the engine through the intake manifold, and we burn those gases to reduce contamination of the ambient. This is the vent valve solenoid, and this is the electrical connector. And here we have two circuits. One circuit is going to be a 12-volt battery, and the other one is going to be a controlled circuit ground. Now for the first part of the test, we're just going to actuate the solenoid valve using the scan tool, just to see if there's any noise coming from the valve when it's actuated. Here I have my scan tool ready on the actuator. So I'm gonna go ahead and actuate it on and off and see if there's any change. Okay, so I just turned it off. Now I'm gonna turn it on to see if there's any change. And there's no change. So So the next thing is we're gonna unplug this connector and we're gonna check for power and ground on both of those circuits. All right, so now that we have this disconnected, we're gonna use the scan tool with the valve turned on, and we're gonna measure for power first. So the pin that is further away from this tab is gonna be your power pin, and we're gonna use the test light connected to a ground, and then we're gonna probe this front pin right here for power. And as you can see, the test light powers on, so that means we have a good power on that pin. Now you want to be really careful with these pins. They bend really easily, so all you have to do is just barely touch it without stabbing your tester into the connector, because you can damage that pin and cause more issues. Now the pin that is closer to this tab is our control circuit. So now with our valve actuated on, we're gonna test for ground with our test light connected to power. And we touch it. As you can see, we got no ground to that circuit, so we probably have an open or a bad controller to the valve. So from here, now we gotta check the whole circuit going to the controller, and if there's no open on the circuit or damage, we may have to replace the controller. For the next part of the testing, we're gonna be here at the fuel pump control module. It's right next to the drive shaft and the exhaust at the back of the vehicle, just for a bit of reference. So I had to go a bit off camera to get this connector apart and back probe the control wire for the valve. And I actually have my scanner right now, and I have the vent valve actuated. So I have a test light connected to battery positive, and this control circuit should be grounded right now and make my test light turn on if the circuit is working properly. So when I go ahead and touch this, you can see the test light barely tries to light up, but it's not enough current to make that vent valve circuit turn on. So from here we have two possible scenarios. Either we have a bad control module, or we could have a bad ground circuit to the control module that is not allowing the control module to send enough of a ground to the vent valve itself. So one last thing we have to check is to make sure we have good powers and good grounds coming into the control module itself before calling this control module bad and having it replaced. Okay, so we moved that pin from the vent valve control circuit to the main ground on the module itself. I had to do that off camera because it's very difficult to get to. You can maybe be able to see it on camera. So now we have our test light connected to battery positive, and if we have a good ground, this should be turned on. There we go. So that means we have a good ground to the module. Now the last thing to check is we want to make sure we have power. So let me switch that pin to a power and do the test again. Last thing to test is to make sure we have good power. So we're at the power pin right now, the main power for the module, and we have our test light connected to ground. So So we're just gonna test that pin. There we go. We have a good power to the module. So what's going on is there's an internal failure to the module, and it's not sending the correct ground signal through this wire to that control valve, and that's why we have that check engine light on. So I just got back from the dealership and I got a new fuel pump control module. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this replaced, and then after that we'll do one final test just to make sure that our repair was successful, and we'll call it a fix. So I'm back here at the control module. I got the new one installed, and I got my test pin on pin 21 for the valve control. I have my test light connected to battery positive, and I have my scan tool ready to actuate the valve. So I just turned on the valve, and now I'm going to use my test light connected to positive, and if we have a good ground control, we should see a light. So there we have it, good light. Now one last thing we can do is just go at the valve to make sure it is clicking when we turn it on and off, and that's going to be my last test. Alright, this time is the last test. So we're here at the valve, and I'm going to just actuate it on and off with the scanner, and we'll see if it's making that clicking noise every time it opens and closes. So that's making the noise, so that means that valve is opening correctly. So now we can just test drive the vehicle and verify that the engine light turns off.